Thank you. Good evening. I'd like to call the Monday, January 11th, 2021 Plan Commission and Commission for Citizen Involvement to order. Iris, would you please call the roll?
Beckett,
Here.
Fisher,
Here.
Heap,
Here.
Pepe,
Here.
Semler is excused, Stewart.
Here.
That's it.
All right, thank you. We have quorum. So I'd like to move on to item number 3 on our agenda. This is a council update. I don't believe we have a council update tonight. So we'll move on to item number 4. This is a citizen comment. It's regarding issues not on the agenda. Iris, was there anyone who wished to make a citizen comment tonight?
No.
So having no citizen comment, we'll move on to the Commission for Citizen Involvement general updates. I didn't have any updates that we'd like to make tonight. Commissioners, anything that commissioners would like to raise for citizen involvement general updates? None. Then we'll move on to our next item, item number 6 on the agenda. These are the minutes, specifically the minutes for December 14th, 2020. Commissioners, any requested changes or comments on the minutes?
No.
None.
I make a motion to accept the minutes. Second.
There's a motion by Commissioner Fisher to accept and approve the minutes of December 14th, 2020.
Second.
And then Commissioner Beckett made the second.
Thank you.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None. Any abstains? None. So then next on our agenda is other business. This is item number 7, House Bills 2001 and 2003, PP 19-008. Public comments are accepted. 5 minutes per individual applies. To provide any comments, it was requested that you email Iris at imccaleb@lakeoswego.city by noon today to receive the Zoom login information. So I think we did get at least one request for public comment tonight, and we'll take that. This is the planning. This is a meeting where the Planning Commission will receive a presentation from Ethan Stuckmayer from the State of Oregon's Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCCD, regarding the recently passed minimum requirements for compliance with House Bill 2001. The Commission will also receive an update from staff on the city's work to comply with the bill and hear about upcoming opportunities for citizens to be involved in the process. Staff coordinator is Erik Olson, senior planner. Senior Planner Olson, would you like to lead us in?
Yeah, 1 second. I'll just start with I'm just going to share my screen really quick. See if I can get it to go full screen. Apologies here. Oop, that's not what I'm hoping to do. Sorry. I need to get into the actual program here and then I can figure it out probably. Okay. There we go. So I just wanted to share this just a general outline of what we could expect to see tonight. So I created a quick slide just with sort of an agenda of what we can expect to cover. So we'll get started with a presentation from Ethan Stuckmayer, as you just mentioned, Chair Heap. Then we'll go to questions and comments from the Planning Commission as well as the general public. And then, as you mentioned, I'll provide an update to close things out on our work to engage with the consultant and explore some existing conditions and on the ground, do some on the ground research before we sort of start talking a little bit more about compliance options and things of that nature. So I'll talk a little bit more about the RFP as well. But at this point, I guess I can just go ahead and hand it over to Ethan at DLCD.
Thanks, Eric. Good evening, Chair Heap and commissioners. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about House Bill 2001. My name is Ethan Stuckmayer. I'm the Senior Housing Planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I've got a slideshow, so I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. Is that true?
Yes, we can see.
Awesome. Okay. And tonight, I'm just going to go over a couple things related to House Bill 2001. I'll first talk a little bit about what it is, what it means, what the intent was, and then we'll jump pretty quickly into timelines, what it means for the city of Lake Oswego, and some of the common questions that we received from cities who are already beginning their implementation phase. So I've been asked to keep it to about 20 minutes, so I'll try to do that. Please do interrupt with questions as needed. I'm more than happy to have this be more of a conversation than just me talking at you. So with that, I think we'll get started. So House Bill 2001 was passed in the 2019 legislative session with the intent of increasing access to housing options and housing choice. It was part of what's now called Oregon's 2019 housing initiatives. That's a suite of 2 bills that were passed to address 2 different aspects of the housing crisis that the state of Oregon and the country at large currently faces. First, like I mentioned, House Bill 2001 is about housing choice and expanding those housing options. House Bill 2003, which I won't talk about tonight, is mostly focused on housing needs and housing production and how cities go about facilitating the production of housing. This is, like I said, 20 minutes. This is not going to be any sort of detail. We're not going to be able to dive into the details. There's so many of those in over the past year since the bill was passed. We've talked about how House Bill 2001 can be implemented. If you are interested, please do go to the DLCD website to find more information about House Bill 2001 and 2003. So House Bill 2001, you might have heard it referenced as the middle housing bill or missing middle housing. This is a type of housing, a housing type on the housing continuum. And the housing continuum is the range of housing options between, on the left-hand side here, you can see detached single-family homes. Those are pretty common. Most people understand what those are. And apartment complexes, multifamily housing on the far right side. But there's a lot of things in between, things that have been over the past 5 or so decades have been really become or made illegal in our cities through zoning or other land use regulations. And so that's why it's called the missing middle. But for the state of Oregon's purposes, middle housing is defined as 4 different housing types. Well, 4 and plus 1. So duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. So that those 5 housing types encompass what Oregon says when we say middle housing. So this, I'm sorry if this is really blurry, but House Bill 2001 requires certain cities of a certain size to allow middle housing and open up their land use regulations to allow these middle housing types in single family detached areas of their city, residential areas of their city. Again, apologies if this is really hard to read, but the important stuff here is that there are 56 cities across the state that are subject to House Bill 2001. The circle cities are the larger cities. They have different requirements than the medium-sized cities, which are shown as triangles on this map. So a little bit more about the differences between medium cities and large cities. Medium cities, those cities who are outside of the Portland metro boundary and have a population between 10,000 and 25,000, are required to allow duplexes on all lots and parcels that are zoned residentially and allow for the development of a single-family detached home. Large cities, which is the category that Lake Oswego falls into, has that same requirement. Allow duplexes on every lot and parcel that is zoned residentially and allows for the development of single-family detached homes. There's an additional requirement on top of that, which is that these cities allow triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters in areas, quote unquote, in areas that allow for the development of single family detached homes. So these, that second portion, we call these kind of the higher level middle housing types. You'll hear me reference that in the future. And then in areas is the key difference here is that the duplexes on every lot and parcel, very, very specific language. That's a known quantity, every lot and parcel. In areas is different. And the legislature left that really up to the department and the rulemaking process to determine. I'm going to step back just one second here. The large cities are required to do both of these things through updating their land use regulations, whether that's the development code or the comprehensive plan, by a certain date. And the deadline for compliance for large cities is June 30th of 2022. For medium cities, that's June 30th of 2021. Okay. So what does this mean to allow middle housing? So large cities have the ability to regulate middle housing, the siting and design of middle housing, such that the standards do not cause unreasonable cost and delay to the development of middle housing. Really, when we say unreasonable cost and delay, what we're talking about is the delta or the gap between the cost and the delay of a specific standard. Any standard, you can take building height, for example, that's associated as it is applied to middle housing, and that comparison between the cost and delay of that same standard applied to a single family detached home or other housing types. So that's what we say when we say reasonableness or unreasonable cost and delay. It's that the measurement between the two standards. All right. So as House Bill 2001 was passed, it didn't have specific standards. It stated cities can apply these specific siting and design standards, but they didn't go into any further detail. What it did do is it directed our department, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, to pass or to adopt or create a model code, a model ordinance that can provide some guidance to cities as they're going through this adoption process and becoming compliant with House Bill 2001. And so we there's two different requirements for different size cities. So that requires two different model codes. And the codes, there's a provision in House Bill 2001 that states the model code applies directly in cities that do not meet the established deadline in the bill. So for Lake Oswego, if they did not adopt compliant standards by June 30th of 2022, the model code that the state of Oregon has adopted would apply directly to development applications for middle housing types. So it would preempt the existing standards in the cities that fall within that category. So it's got kind of two different purposes. The first is to be a resource, to provide some guidance to cities as they're going through the adoption process, but it also has that regulatory enforcement mechanism on top of that. In addition to the model code, and we know throughout the rulemaking process that the model code is exactly that. It's a model, it's a very high standard, and it needs to be specific. It's one set of standards to comply with House Bill 2001. As we were going through that rulemaking process, it became very clear that there was a necessity to provide some additional clarity to cities who did not want to adopt the high standard of the model code and instead needed to understand kind of the floor and the ceiling of what is acceptable to actually become compliant with House Bill 2001. And this set up this dichotomy. You've got the model code, which is a very specific set of standards. It's one way of doing it. But what about all the other ways? And that's what we call the minimum compliance standards. This is where the flexibility lives for cities in how they just want to go forward and comply with House Bill 2001. the model code is just one way of doing that. So you can think of the minimum compliance standards as this kind of big umbrella where all of the acceptable, the reasonable standards live, and the model code is kind of just one path that exists under that, that umbrella. We'll talk about the minimum compliance standards in a little bit more detail. So throughout both the model code and the minimum compliance standards, we've defined the siting and design standards applicable to middle housing. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just for illustrative purposes, but generally, siting design standards are the standards that are related to the position, bulk, scale, or form of a structure on a site. And design standards would be the aesthetics, the number, and the orientation of specific features of a structure. So siting standards, of course, that's how a building and other features sit on the site, and then the design standards are what those actually look like and what that structure actually looks like. So siting standards, minimum lot size, maximum density, setbacks, building height, off-street parking, kind of the major ones. And design standards, these are less defined because there are so many different design standards that any number of cities apply to single family detached homes or just residential development in general, that the state took kind of a deferring status to cities and said, you can come up with these design standards if they're not more stringent than what you apply to single family detached homes in the same zone, then we feel like those are fine and well and good. We took a little bit of a different approach with siting standards, those being more geared towards how can we create the best opportunity for middle housing to be developed in our cities. And of course, thinking about how we also apply those same standards to single family detached homes. So at this point, I'm going to take an example here of building height and kind of just illustrate the difference between the model code, the minimum compliance standards, and then how that relates to single family detached homes. So let's just say the building height, the maximum building height for a single family detached home in a specific zone in Lake Oswego is 25 feet. You can build up to 25 feet. In order to comply with House Bill 2001, the model code would say you have to apply the same maximum building height to the development of a triplex in that same zone. So it's just exactly the same. The minimum compliance standards would say the city has some options here. They can go at 25 feet to match that, or they can go higher. They just cannot go lower or more restrictive than what's allowed for a single family detached home. So the building height, the maximum building height for a quadplex could be 30 feet, 40 feet, whatever the decision is at the local level, but it just can't be 20 feet because that would be more restrictive than what's allowed for a single family detached home. So I hope that was helpful to kind of make sense of that. So I was asked to kind of provide some additional information about some of the challenges that cities are already facing, or some of the common questions. Here's a pretty long list. I won't go through all of these, but this will just kind of give you a sense of what's kind of coming down the pipeline. The rules were adopted through the Land Conservation Development on December 9th. So the rules are just barely a month old. So as you might imagine, we are just kind of all in a steep learning curve here as we're implementing these and just kind of getting the ball rolling. But I'll just kind of pick a couple here. So our mixed use zone subject to House Bill 2001 compliance, cottage cluster standards. This is kind of a new building type or a new housing type for just the state of Oregon generally. So there's, I think, a lot of lingering questions about what even are cottage clusters, what's the building separation, how big can these cottages be, what are the parking standards, what's the landscaping standards. I hear a lot, or throughout the rulemaking process, I heard a lot about, our city X has been trying to chase cottage cluster development for so long, and we never see any cottage cluster development actually taking place. What standards should we apply to actually facilitate that cottage cluster development, and we're trying to work through it as a state, um, uh, as we're going through this process. And as you might imagine, designing a specific set of standards that can apply to Lake Oswego, that also applies to Medford, that also applies to Salem, that also applies to Portland, is nearly an impossible task. We're trying to provide as much flexibility and options to cities as we can, but while also understanding that we can't cause undue burden to the development of middle housing. So that's the balance we're trying to strike. This second to last one here, would the model code apply to all middle housing types if the city is out of compliance in just one type? We've structured the model code rules such that it can be kind of this segmentation strategy to applying the model code. So if a city comes in and says, here are our standards for all of the middle housing types, and we kind of go through on DLCD's part and review all of those standards and say, okay, all of these look good, check, 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 except for this particular standard for townhomes. If the city, has the chance to go back and fix that standard to come into compliance, that's great. If they would like to challenge that or do something else, then the townhome only section of the model code would apply until such time that the city can remedy or come into compliance with the rules. So I hope I'm not creating more confusion or creating more questions that I'm answering here, but
hey, Ethan, do you mind if
yeah.
I jump in a second?
Please.
a lot, I wouldn't say a lot, but some of the discussion that we've had centered around this term or reference that's in areas that, relative to presumably locations where middle housing could be applicable. Where did you guys fall with that finally?
Yeah, so that was quite a long discussion, a roundabout discussion to some extent about how do we define in areas. And so my boss at DLCD liked to describe defining in areas as it's every lot and parcel in a city minus one or just one lot and parcel. And so that's the range that we were looking at. But ultimately, the decision, and the Land Conservation and Development Commission made the decision that it's pretty much you cast a wide net and then get smaller and smaller and smaller based on areas where middle housing does not make a whole lot of sense. So the kind of step through process to defining in areas is you start at pretty much every lot and parcel. You delete out the what we call goal protected land, so things like floodplains or natural hazard areas or landslide areas, all of those kind of things. And then you also take out, there's a little bit of a nuance there for master plan communities, areas that are kind of planned areas that are 20 acres or larger, have some different requirements. And then also areas that have infrastructure constraints. And so part of that conversation about the infrastructure constrained lands is twofold, I guess. The first is that the legislature, when they are drafting and passing House Bill 2001, provided an option for cities to say, we don't have the infrastructure in a particular area of our city, and therefore we're going to establish this plan of action to remedy that infrastructure deficiency. And while we are executing that plan, however long that takes, we can delay the enactment of middle housing provisions in that area. And so we call that the infrastructure-based time extension request, or lovingly known as the IBTR process. And cities who are interested in going down that route, large cities in particular, have until June 30th of 2021 to request an extension of the time where middle housing provisions are enacted in that infrastructure constrained land. There's also another route that would say, if the infrastructure just isn't there, you're looking at an individual lot or parcel, and the infrastructure is not there. You have I don't know, you're in a part of your city that cannot provide the sewer infrastructure. There's no stormwater mitigation plan or something like that. The developer has the right to either provide that infrastructure if they're able to, or the or the city can request that that infrastructure be provided through the typical building permit and land use review process. But if the infrastructure just can't be available or can't be made available, it's just too expensive, that's just part of the typical development process. They have to secure the building permits, and if there's not the infrastructure there to provide the building permit, then probably any type of development is not going to be sufficient or be able to be accommodated on that lot and parcel. So I hope that answered the question. There's lots of nuance there, and I can get into that in more detail if we want.
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So just a couple, this is my last slide before we just jump into to full-on questions. So again, the large cities are required to update their local codes by June 30th of 2022. Lake Oswego and other cities across the state have already taken advantage of the $3.5 million that have been provided to cities to update their development codes and come into compliance. That I guess it wasn't fully $3.5 million. The legislature took back about $1.5 million in the summer just due to COVID budget shortfalls. But the good news is the legislature is already considering an additional $3.5 million to begin in the next biennium in 2021 into 2023. So cities like Lake Oswego who are needing to continue to update their codes beyond just the end of this biennium may have additional money available to actually do that work with consultants and or staff. And then of course, I and the rest of the DLCD housing team are ready and available to help out as much as we can. Attending meetings like this and continuing the conversation. I'm more than happy to kind of come back at any future time and have a workshop or a continued more technical conversation about the nitty gritty of building heights or parking or anything like that. So do feel like, please do use me as a resource. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Again, I know that was really, really high level and probably wasn't able to get into as much detail, but fire away with questions, please.
Thank you, Ethan. Commissioners, are there questions that you would like to ask Ethan?
I have a question.
Sure. Go ahead, Commissioner Beckett.
Part where it talks about master plan communities. In Lake Oswego, Mountain Park was really a leader for the entire country in putting together a thorough master plan. How is that affected by this?
Yeah, so master plans that were, has that community already been kind of built out, or is that a new community? I'm sorry, I'm not familiar.
The Mountain Park master plan was done decades ago.
Okay. Yeah, so in a master plan community that's already been built out and established, the provisions for kind of where higher level middle housing or just even duplexes would apply in those master plan communities, just like any other neighborhood that is not master planned kind of already previously. But new master plan communities that are forthcoming have a little bit of nuance about how much middle housing they need to allow and the densities that they'll achieve and so on and so forth.
So maybe a follow-on question to Commissioner Beckett's question, Ethan. This is Scott Siegel, Planning and Building Director. So Mountain Park is an example of a master plan community that has middle housing in it. It has multiplexes, townhomes, and single-family detached homes, as well as more conventional apartments. So if we were to look at that area just as an example, there's 8,000 people who live in that neighborhood, so it's pretty significant parts, about 25% of the 20% of the population. If we looked at that and we broke it down, and we were looking at the distribution of middle housing types within that area, would we be looking at that entire area that is zoned residential, or would we only be looking at the single-family detached neighborhoods within that community and then trying to apportion middle housing within that?
That's a good question. Yeah, so a couple of things. The first is that there are a couple of things that need to line up in order for House Bill 2001 to actually even be in effect or be applicable in a particular instance. So the first is that it is in a comprehensive plan that is residential, and that would include mixed use residential lands, because that's both, or I'm sorry, mixed use comprehensive plan designations, because that's both residential and commercial. It needs to be zoned residentially. And then the third piece is that zoning needs to allow for a single family detached home. So you can imagine a really higher density zone that doesn't even allow a single family detached home would not be subject to the requirements of House Bill 2001, because that's one of the base requirements. But when we're thinking, and then, so that's one piece. The second piece is when we're thinking about where middle housing will be in effect, or where House Bill 2001 impacts our cities, is at the zoning level. So it would be an allowed use at a zoning district level. And that would just be one of the options that's available to a developer or a property owner who owns a piece of property within that zoning district. So it's not a prescription of middle housing, rather it is an opportunity for a developer to build middle housing. It doesn't mean that it will take place in our master plan communities. Master plan communities are great because they provide a lot of, incentives, lots of amenities for families, and maybe that's not the market for middle housing, or maybe that's just not the area where somebody would want to put a quadplex.
Commissioner Fisher, do you have a question?
Yeah, there seems to be a panic in the community, the people I speak to, where they think that the whole Lake Oswego is going to change to multifamily high rises and things like that. Just for talking purposes, we're talking about allowance, not mandatory. So we can't forbid a duplex from being built somewhere. But if some, if Lake Oswego still produces single family homes, there's no penalty for that, right? Okay, it's just
Yeah,
allowance,
absolutely.
it's not mandatory.
That's
I think the community doesn't, at least the people I've been speaking to, don't seem to understand that.
Right. That's exactly right. Thank you, Commissioner, for pointing that out. It's like I mentioned, it's an opening up of the potential opportunities for a property owner to build a different type of housing, or it's providing yet another permitted use on a piece of property. It's not a requirement that you must build a certain amount of middle housing.
Thank you.
Commissioners, other questions? Commissioner Stewart?
Yeah, I've got one, and I'm not sure exactly how to phrase it, but going back to sort of the pre-created master plan communities that are already sort of set in place and have they have written CCRs, they have an HOA, the residents have signed these sorts of agreements, expecting a certain sort of development pattern. What has there been any discussion at the state about when these changes are implemented, how that affects those sorts of agreements,
Mhm.
like legally?
Yeah, really, really good question, and one that we thought quite a bit about, battled back and forth with our lawyers, with even legislators as we're trying to understand the intent of House Bill 2001. And maybe this is also getting to Commissioner Beckett's question as I'm understanding it a little bit better, is CC&Rs and House Bill 2001, CC&Rs are treated only in one instance. It prohibits future CC&Rs from being created or recorded that would prohibit middle housing from being developed. So at the date that Governor Brown signed the bill, no future CC&Rs could be created. That doesn't say anything about retroactively changing existing CC&Rs. Those are agreements between property owners. The state is not a party to those contracts and has no ability to change those contracts. And so when we were talking about in the rulemaking process about should we try to think about how middle housing is going to be allowed in the CC&R areas, we decided, you know what, that's a question for the legislature. If they wanted to do that, then they had the opportunity. I mean, they were sitting right there with the pen to retroactively or attempt to retroactively change those CC&Rs, but any of those existing CC&Rs are still intact and are not impacted by House Bill 2001 or the rules.
So this is that we've actually had some conversations in Erik Olson's monthly updates and trying to kind of get our heads around this too. And I know Evan Boone, our attorney here who's in the meeting, we've talked about, the city has certain obligations under the bill to amend its zoning regulations, notwithstanding these private covenants that are out there. There still may be private covenants that are going to preclude, middle housing on certain lots. And then wouldn't it be the private dispute between the property owners, Evan, if someone, is seeking a building permit for middle housing in a neighborhood that has that restrictive covenant that predates the bill? Our obligation is legally required to apply the code and the building code as well. So we're not interpreting covenants and telling residents that they're not able to apply.
Right. I see Ethan nodding affirmatively and all of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair summary of our prior discussions. We do not apply, we do not regulate the private covenants, and neither does House Bill 2001. So for prior covenants, they stand as they are. For purposes of trying to forecast what population could be handled, we might have to look at the covenants to see, well, those established caps on the inventory. But as far as actual applications for development, we would not. Those are not part of our criteria. If we have to zone it, so be it. It may not take. Okay. And then there is when you get down into the enforceability of the covenants, there is a doctrine that's called public policy as a defense to the enforcement of covenants. However, the private parties would have to duke it out. Usually private policy, the public policy provision defense doesn't come into play. And I would think in this case where the legislature has specifically said these covenants can continue on it. So I don't see that the legislature, which as Mr. Stuckmayer indicated, it had the chance to strike them down and it didn't. So there's a public policy to continue prior existing covenants, notwithstanding our code provisions. So I think bottom line is, I think they would end up standing. We don't enforce them.
Another point, if I can raise it.
Sure. Go ahead, Commissioner Beckett.
Reading the material, as I interpret it, the state will provide model code, and what we heard tonight was there's a maximum model code and a minimum model code. It says the model, one of the things that I would think we would want to do is modify the model code to not allow middle housing on Goal 5 properties Goal 5 has several categories to it, one of which is natural resources. Well, Lake Oswego is embedded around and surrounded by natural resources. So I would think we would want to modify the model code to protect lakefront, main canal properties, properties on the Willamette River, and properties on the Tualatin River, because you wouldn't want to crowd too many properties, too many houses, even duplexes perhaps on those properties unless they were very large because of both flood risks, accessibility, and various other reasons. Those lakefront, canal, riverfront properties need to be protected from the impact of this 2001.
So we're going to be looking at each of the goals that applies there, and there's some. I know we're probably not going to get into the details tonight, but there's even some protection afforded to historic resources, historic landmarks. But the rules have some pretty detailed language around that, where even their middle housing is to be accommodated in some fashion. So there's a lot of work for us to do just to understand the rules and how they apply.
Right.
Yeah, Ethan, maybe one question is, following up on Commissioner Beckett's question, is one thing that we do get in the Plan Commission is a lot of questions related to, what is Lake Oswego's strategy, and it seems like there's general confusion on, that what type of collateral is out there from the state that cities like Lake Oswego can use. So we understand, there's the medium city model code, which is not going to apply to us, but then there's the large city in metro area model code. But is there also a document that states what the minimal code requirements is for a large and metro area? Is there something that specifically calls out these are the minimal requirements? Or how could the community better understand what those minimal requirements are, since we're really looking to tailor our implementation in Lake Oswego? I think if the community can understand clearly that we're looking at the minimal implementation, and that may be helpful to understand the direction that we're going and what considerations we can take into place.
Yeah, really good question, and it highlights my inability to communicate that clearly in the presentation. So the model code is drafted. It looks, well, it's intended to look just like any city's development code. So it's got chapters, it's got definition, a purpose, and all the standards. We can do that because it's one specific set of standards, and it needs to be written such that it can be applied directly, right, without further interpretation or amendment. The minimum compliance standards is a little bit different because here we're using language like a city is not required to apply building setbacks to the development of middle housing, but if they so choose, then these are the parameters. And all of those rules, that minimum compliance is in what we call, or what's called, Oregon Administrative Rule, OARs, and those were adopted through the Land Conservation Development Commission. We created a new division in Chapter 660 of Oregon Administrative Rules, Division 46, and that's where it's got all of the standards. It's got more information than you're probably interested in reading about what are those standards and what is the process and the definitions and all that kind of stuff.
Right, thank you.
Yep, and that was made effective on the 31st of December, so it's 11 days old.
Just quickly, I think there should be at least a link. I think a link, if not as an attachment, that should be included in the most recent staff report that was provided for this meeting.
If I could go back and just address Commissioner Beckett's question about historic resources and natural hazard lands. So duplexes are a little bit different in this instance, right? We know that duplexes have to be allowed on every single lot and parcel that allows for a single family detached home that's zoned residentially. So even in those, floodplain areas, even in those areas that are in natural hazard areas, if a single family detached home is allowed, a duplex is also But for higher level middle housing, oh, I'm sorry.
Not according to the documents that we've been given, that's not true.
I guess which documents, I guess I'm not sure which documents that you received, but the language in House Bill 2001 is very clear that single family duplexes are allowed in every lot and parcel that is also allowing a single family detached home. For a higher level middle housing, that's where there's some additional thought that needs to take place, and Scott mentioned how historic districts are treated differently than for higher level middle housing than for single family detached homes and natural resource areas. So just wanted to touch on that little nuance there.
Thank you. We do have, I believe, some comments that the public would like to make. So I'd like to take public questions and comments now. Iris, do we have anyone that's wishing to make a public comment?
Yes, we have Chip Corbett. Let me move him in. Hang on.
Thank you. Mr. Corbett, we'd like to recognize you and give you the opportunity to ask a question or take a comment. Before we do that, Attorney Boone, is there any comments that you'd like to make on our procedural process?
Just procedurally, the 5-minute rule will apply to anybody testifying, whether on their own behalf or not others. This is not a public hearing in that regard, which the time could be expanded by the commission. That's up to you. I will notify orally when we reach the 1-minute mark.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Corbett. Mr. Corbett, would you like to introduce yourself and your name, your address for the record, and then make any comments or ask questions?
Great. Yes, my name is Chip Corbett. I live at 1040 Upper Devon Lane here in Lake Oswego, 97034. And so a Trojan horse for the benefit of developers and precisely against the city of Lake Oswego with respect to our denomination as a city of trees. I am concerned that promoting this kind of housing will lead to the destruction of our arbor canopy here in Lake Oswego. And as far as middle housing is concerned, it is antithetical to the city of Lake Oswego to tear down the older small homes and construct maximized footprint new homes. That's a bad idea. You will end up removing established trees. In a similar vein, I'm not in favor of creating duplexes from single homes or apartment complexes where forests once stood. We have seen this already in action in this city all over the place. So I believe that we need a more egalitarian neighborhood, and this approach is not the one that we should want. Instead, what we would like to do, I would propose the following. Provide for those people who work in this town, teachers, janitors, healthcare workers, and others, modest lodging as a benefit. The city should provide housing as a benefit. So this would retain the charming existing exteriors of buildings that are already here. The city could improve those existing single-family homes for those that need the space. And this has a historical precedent, especially in Old Town here in Lake Oswego. If you go to 40 Wilbur Street, you'll find the Iron Workers Museum. That was a company town housing. We can reproduce that kind of housing here just using existing infrastructure. So if we could do this in the 1880s, some 140 years ago, I think we could probably do this in the 2020s now. There are other notes that I had, but in the interest of time, I will leave it at that. And thank you very much for your consideration of my comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Corbett. I'd like to ask commissioners if they have any questions for Mr. Corbett. Vice Chair Pape?
So in reading your testimony that you submitted and then hearing what you just provided, are you suggesting that the city of Lake Oswego purchase homes and get into home ownership and buying the real estate in order to offer?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, indeed.
Okay.
I have a question for Mr. Corbett.
Please.
Commissioner Beckett, go ahead.
If you looked at the Merrillhurst campus and the plans that are afoot there to tear down some of the old residences that were dormitories and replace those with multifamily housing, would that satisfy the need?
Well, the marriage hang on. The Merrillhurst campus is a special case in that it was once a university, and as a university, it served purpose in the neighborhood. It is now being converted, as far as I understand, to perhaps assisted living or other such things. And since that university has already gone under, and since that land is already being used, it seems that conversions there would not be an issue.
Commissioners, any other questions for Mr. Corbett? One final question, Mr. Corbett, is that you know, we have Ethan here today from the state, and do you feel like your suggestions can be implemented in a way that's compliant with the state code mandates that we have?
Absolutely. Yeah, yes, absolutely. If I am reading the state code correctly, under section 2, item number 6, this section does not prohibit local governments from permitting single-family dwellings in areas zoned to allow for single-family dwellings or for middle housing in areas not required under this section. If we don't tear according to HB 2001, as far as I can.
I believe maybe we had some difficulty in the audio. It was a little bit choppy, but I understand, Mr. Corbett, your response was that you believe it is compliant under the section, and you think this is maybe something the city should consider as far as how do we adhere to what the minimal code requirements are to meet the kind of state mandates that have been given to Lake Oswego. So,
correct.
Any other final questions, Mr. Corbett? See none. Thank you, Mr. Corbett, for your testimony tonight. I really appreciate it.
I think Commissioner Pape had his hand up.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Vice Chair Pepe, did you have another question?
Yeah, it was following off of what I was asking prior. I did not read, nor have I heard tonight also, and with what funding source are you suggesting that the city of Lake Oswego use in order to, one, purchase the homes, two, manage the properties on a day-to-day or month-to-month, and three, maintain them going forward?
This is an excellent question, and a city that can create a brand new city hall probably has enough funds to buy a few old houses. I'm suspecting that the city of Lake Oswego, of any place in Oregon, could afford this particular effort.
Well, but in addition to that question, do you have an idea of what that cost would be right now based on who? I'm sorry, what was that?
No, I have no idea, nor do I know how many people would need this. I'm only suggesting that this should be done for those people who work in the city. That would be teachers, janitors, healthcare workers, and such.
So work in the city for the city, or simply work in the city?
The city of Lake Oswego, specifically, and not necessarily for the city, but those who are of modest means and would have difficulty affording housing here otherwise.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, commissioners. I don't, I see one comment from Director Siegel. Director Siegel.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Heap. And I just wanted to make a brief comment in response to Mr. Corbett's testimony. The observation that the city could use more housing that's affordable to the local workforce is really astute. And that is actually something that the City Council has prioritized over the past several years. And the Planning Commission's had a role in reviewing the zoning, making code amendments, adopting financial incentives for things like accessory dwelling units, smaller cottage-like homes for people either to rent or, actually to rent, and also to produce more affordable below market rate housing for the local workforce. So although it's not city owned, the city council has prioritized that and doing it in partnership with the community, including nonprofit housing providers and others. So there is a way to deliver affordable housing. The city just has not taken that on as a kind of a developer or a landlord, if you will.
Thank you, Director Siegel, for those comments. Commissioners, any final questions for Mr. Corbett? I see none. Thank you, Mr. Corbett, again for your testimony. And then also, I'd like to try to stay on schedule tonight. So we had anticipated about an hour for the presentation tonight from Mr. Stuckmayer, and we've reached that limit. I will give a last opportunity. Any final questions that we'd like to take, for Mr. Stuckmayer while we have him here, and then also just recognize we're kind of at our time limit. So if anybody has any kind of high priority questions, we can ask those, but these will be our final questions. Commissioner Beckett.
Yeah, this isn't a question, but I just want to applaud Mr. Stuckmayer for the work that he's done on helping to clarify this for us and hopefully be a resource to ask further questions as we move forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Beckett. I'd like to second that. Mr. Stuckmayer, I really appreciate you coming out and talking to our commission tonight. It's late in the evening and, this is really, really helpful. So appreciate all your, engagement here and participation in our commission meeting tonight. It's really appreciated.
Of course, thank you for inviting me. And like I mentioned before, I'm more than happy to come back anytime. So just let me know.
Great, thank you.
Erik has some final comments and remarks that kind of close the loop on this conversation.
Sure. Senior Planner Olson, I cannot hear you. You might still be on mute.
That is correct. So I just want to join everybody else in thanking Ethan for coming and presenting to us and helping answer questions and for being so generous with offering his time. As promised, though, I will give you a brief update about the outreach that we're conducting currently. It's actually just now picking up for phase 1 of House Bill 2001. So you can see on the screen here, this is a rough kind of outline of the schedule for phase 1. And I would remind folks that this is just one of a multi-phase project. This is the first of multi-phase project here. So we can anticipate, this is really just, one sort of snapshot out of a larger sort of 1.5 year long or 2 year long timeline or so. But as you can see, based on the timeline, we're here in early January 2021. The work that we've done with the consultants has included, some initial background work, a lot of more quantitative work for the last month or 1.5 months or so. So they've been doing some work to analyze existing neighborhood conditions, as well as some more qualitative analysis, looking at neighborhood patterns. And so this will be sort of the next deliverable that we expect to see from the consultants. We've already seen some drafts of the neighborhood conditions report, but we do expect the next couple of months really to be focused on the development of what we call the neighborhood character report. And this is kind of, again, that qualitative component of the work that we're doing, this sort of initial study for phase 1. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I also just want to make sure we're keeping this in the larger sort of context of the project. So those are the two deliverables, the sort of quantitative and qualitative analyses that I've been referring to. There are 5 deliverables in total that we expect from the consultant. In addition to those, they will be providing us with an audit of the comprehensive plan, as well as an audit of the community development code to identify areas of the code that would need to be changed in order to reach compliance with House Bill 2001. As well as eventually all of these deliverables will inform a middle housing opportunities report, and that will be really a summary of different recommendations they would make in terms of paths, different sort of alternatives that the city could consider as we strive to reach compliance with House Bill 2001. So at that point in May, we expect myself and the consultant, Cascadia Partners, will come and present the results of our work to you. So again, expect that in May, and we'll be able to talk a little bit more about all of these different deliverables and sort of the work that they're doing. Back to sort of the neighborhood character report and the work that we're currently undergoing this month. I just want to make it clear that it's been a pretty, it's been an action-packed year, I guess, so far, and we have a lot of future engagement events for people to help us sort of inform this neighborhood character report and help identify some of the neighborhood patterns that they feel are most characteristic of their community and that they sort of feel the most strongly about, that they appreciate the most. So this is all kind of unrolling in the very near future. We have a informational meeting with representatives from all of the different neighborhood associations that is scheduled for this Friday. And so we'll be providing folks with essentially an overview of what to expect, how they can provide input to inform this particular deliverable. We will then be meeting individually. Myself, I'll be conducting approximately 24 interviews with different representatives from all of the neighborhoods that we can essentially gather, try to get as many of Lake Oswego's neighborhoods represented as we can. And so we will be interviewing individuals from as many neighborhoods as we possibly can for about 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks actually. That will be approximately the final 2 weeks of January, so starting on the 19th roughly after Martin Luther King holiday, and going in through the first week of February, so roughly ending on the 5th of February. We'll be holding interviews with various different neighborhood association representatives, as well as distributing a online tool or survey that will have sort of similar questions so that we can get as much input as possible. So essentially, for the folks that aren't able to meet with us individually to discuss, more in depth their sort of visual and different types of preferences about their neighborhood and what they hold dear, we will be offering an online option as well, so folks can share that input with us if they don't have the time to meet with us personally. So yeah, I think that covers everything that I wanted to cover for now. Really just wanted to let folks know that there are opportunities to become engaged and provide some input for our work, and those will be unrolling roughly, the interviews and the online survey between the 19th of February and the 5th of, between the 19th of January and the 5th of February. So last 2 weeks of January and the 1st of February.
I have a question for Erik.
Go ahead, Commissioner Beckett.
Yes, how soon will we receive copies of the model code, both the minimum code and the maximum code?
So I have provided those as attachments in recent staff reports. What I can do is just kind of send a quick summary, though. There's been a lot of sort of a winding road, I guess, as we've explored this process for the last year. So I can send you final links so the sort of best places to go and have a sort of quick repository of where to find it.
Yes, I think we should get the final copies and complete. I would suggest we take 3 steps. 1, wait for the model code to be presented to us. 2, modify the model code to not allow middle housing on Goal 5 properties, which of course includes lakefront, main canal, and the rivers. And 3, if a planned community such as Mountain Park has more than 12 units per acre do not force more density.
Thank you, Commissioner Beckett, for those comments. Any other questions from commissioners? Yeah, Commissioner Stewart.
I do, Eric. I do have one question about the public outreach to the neighborhoods. If there are a couple neighborhoods representatives that you're not able to get in contact with, and for some reason cannot contact them remotely as well, will those neighborhoods still be included in the character report?
Absolutely, yeah. We're trying to gather a lot of information, and the consultants have been looking through a lot of different information as well. So, we're looking at a number of different sort of GIS layers and sort of that quantitative information in addition to neighborhood plans, trying to get a handle of where we do have some planned unit developments and talking briefly about those. But there's a lot of reconnaissance actually that the consultant has done. They've been personally visiting all the neighborhoods and sort of doing sort of a scroll through and taking lots of pictures and exploring as a team. And so there's a lot of different information that they're going to be incorporating here. And again, there will be that survey. So we'll really try to make sure that that's well publicized. I think we'll be able to reiterate this in the Hello LO for February. So we will be able to get sort of another push in terms of the communication media for folks to at least be alerted of this. And yeah, we're going to try to find as people from each individual neighborhood, and we might need to sort of push fairly hard on some of the ones that might not have been quite as active, certain neighborhood associations. So I think that will be something that we're mindful of, and know that it will be a little more work to reach out to those folks.
Okay, thank you.
So Chair Heap and Commissioners, I just forwarded on a message from Ethan, and he's pointing us to the Oregon Administrative Rules, which are now posted. They're online, they're live, anyone can access it. He's provided a direct link to that, and the model code are actually attachments under the first section of that administrative rule division. So hope that helps.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Fisher.
Thanks. Just Eric, Planner Olson. I assume that all of these things, these analyses, are going to be printed in some form. Is it possible for us to get a copy, or if not, make it more generally online so that people can see it?
Absolutely, Commissioner Fisher. I think we'll both have an online copy and would be, happy to try to make some, physical printouts for, commissioners as requested. So yeah, that is definitely our intention, is to try to get these, accessible to folks to be able to see what's in them. And, really, I think the goal is to try to provide a baseline of sorts, a baseline of information as a foundation to have future conversations as we move forward this spring and summer.
Thank you.
One thing I wanted to add, and we've talked about, this first phase being a study, which is really what it is. And the second phase, which should begin around May, will be more of a community planning process. So there will be, much more broad community engagement. We would expect to have, a project portal or some online site, a page where you can land and get the current information on the project. Where are we at on the schedule? When's the next meeting? How do I comment? How do I participate? And allow for more interaction, frankly, because the first phase is not really a planning process. It's more of a discovery process and gathering information for that planning effort.
Thank you, Director Siegel. Commissioners, any other questions? I see none. Vice Chair Pape, you have a question?
Yeah, just real quick on a clarification. In the character discovery of the neighborhoods, are where there are businesses and whatnot, are you also reaching out to those businesses in order to get their feedback as well? or is it just residents?
You know, so far we've been focusing on residents because the nature of the bill is that it's specific to residential housing. But you know, I think, and you know, we are certainly going to be crafting the questions in such a way that makes it clear that we're looking for input related to housing specifically because that's the scope of the bill. However, you know, if you have a suggestion to include somebody in particular or business leaders that you think would be good to reach out to, I'm very open to that.
No, it makes a lot of sense that it's just homeowners or residents.
That actually brings up a good question. And for those of the commissioners who attended the Boards and Commissions Summit last week, there was a lot of discussion. I thought a lot of really good energy and dialogue between the different board and commission members about the work that you're doing on House Bill 2001. There seemed to be much interest from the 50 Plus Advisory Board, the Sustainability Advisory Board. I think the Transportation Board is also interested in this. So one question for you as the Commission for Citizen Involvement is, you know, as we go forward, when we start to design the public engagement process, you know, would you want us to involve the other boards? And, you know, the DRC at some point will be responsible for implementing the codes that we come up with. So it may not be until the second phase, but at some point, I think I'm asking you if you think there would be some value in having, you know, joint work sessions or a roundtable of sorts, or eventually when we get to the point where, you know, the city council is appointing an advisory committee, of course, you know, it would make sense to have representation from each of those boards. But I just wanted to plant that seed and ask you if you have any, for those of you who attended the summit, if you had any feedback or reflection on that.
Director Siegel, I can comment. I attended the Boards and Commissions Summit, and certainly, you know, mandates from the state or just mandates in general was one of the major themes. And then, you know, combined that with that was, you know, how do we work well and effectively with the other boards and commissions together? So I think there was large kind of outcalling for that type of joint involvement on, you know, like House Bill 2001. And so I definitely recommend that we look at a session where we could, you know, work together and take inputs from the boards and commissions that have identified that, you know, they'd like to provide that input. So I think it's a good idea. Commissioners, for anyone else who attended or anyone that has any other comments, would you like to?
Yeah, Chair, I would concur with you. I heard the same thing in our breakout group that there was a lot of interest across the boards and commissions in this, you know, the implementation of House Bill 2001 and how that affects everybody. So I think it would be good to kind of have, you know, some sort of meeting of the minds, if you will, you know, later in the year.
Yeah, I was unfortunately not able to attend the Boards and Commissions Summit, but I do think it would be very beneficial if we brought in and had some roundtables and/or joint sessions with some of the other commissions.
I agree. House Bill 2001 came to the top of the discussion in multiple breakout groups.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or any final comments, Planner Olson? Should we conclude? I see no other questions or comments, so I assume we'll conclude this session.
Bye-bye.
This was only for the section 7 on the agenda, other business for House Bills 2001, 2003. So we'd like to continue the meeting. For other business, I think there's only 2 other comments that I'd like to make. And thank you again, Planner Olson, for your updates tonight. And thanks to Ethan for coming also. But on other business, I would like to make 2 comments. One is I'd like to acknowledge that we did receive from staff today the request from the DRC for looking at the parking standards, specifically with the downtown redevelopment district, and then also the Lake Grove Village Center. So at this point, we'll acknowledge that we received that, and then we'll look for staff and to council to maybe give us some feedback on the next steps, and we'll wait for them to come back and let us know what the next steps are on that. So that was one comment. And then the second one on other business, I think earlier some of the commissioners referred to, I just like to thank Commissioner Ken Whitman for his service. We received that he is resigning from the commission due to personal reasons today. So I wish Commissioner Whitman the best, and really appreciate all the service that he provided to the Planning Commission. It's much appreciated. Those were the only other agenda items I had under other business. So commissioners, any questions or comments? None? Then I'd like to move on to agenda item number 8, the schedule review. Director Siegel, would you like to give us an update on the schedule?
Thank you, Chair Heap. There are no items scheduled for what would be your next regularly scheduled meeting on the 19th. So we'll want to get together, or not the 19th, excuse me, the 25th. Is that right?
Yeah, the 25th,
Okay.
correct, yeah.
Yeah, so Rob, you and I should probably get together, take a look at the goals. We're still awaiting the council to go through their goal setting process, but assuming that, some of those items that you had prioritized move forward, we'll look at the calendar, kind of strategize when to bring certain things forward. Frankly, we haven't been able to bring forward the work that was in progress at the end of last year, because on the floodplain code update, we're still waiting for comments back from FEMA on that until we can move forward. Updates to the citizen involvement guidelines, the status on that, the working draft that you last reviewed early in 2020. We put that on hold while the city's diversity, equity, and inclusion task force was doing their work. They have presented their recommendation. The city council accepted it. So we're now working with the staff who is the lead on that initiative, and we've asked them to take a look at the work that is in progress of the citizen involvement guidelines. We want to see how we can calibrate the two, or we can get the guidelines in sync with that work, and then bring that back to you along with a response, or at least some recommendations regarding the input that you receive from the neighborhood chairs. So before it comes back to you, one, we will confirm that kind of the work that we've developed so far is in alignment with DEI recommendations. And secondly, we'll touch base with the neighborhood association chairs who had provided comments to you, and make sure that everyone is prepared to resume that discussion. The other work that was underway, the review of the Lake Grove Village Center design standards and West Lake Grove design standards. I know that the Lake Grove Business Association has developed, or they're developing their recommendations, and they do plan on bringing those forward to you. I'll check in with their chair and see if they would be prepared to do that in the first quarter of this year. I think that's probably the first item that would move forward, at least for a work session. And then beyond that, we do have some dates that are tentatively scheduled, or they're shown on the schedule for potential public hearings on rezoning application for the Boones Ferry Road staging site. But that's the update. So again, there's no business scheduled so far for the 25th, but I'll work with you, Rob, and if there's anything that the commissioners would want to bring forward or begin working on, we're more than happy to accommodate that.
Sure, thank you, Director Siegel. Commissioners, any questions on the schedule? None? Then I think that is it for tonight. Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays, Happy New Year. Thanks for everybody's input, and we'll give you an update as soon as Director Siegel and I have more information on the agenda for next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Good
Thank
night,
you, everybody. Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you.